Black CEO mocked for using black card on Billionaire Yacht. Instantly cancels a $3.8 billion deal. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's go back to the main character. Marcus Ellison stood on the teak deck of the White Meridian as the late afternoon sun slid low over the Pacific, turning the water into sheets of gold, the kind of quiet luxury where voices softened and laughter carried just far enough to be heard, but never enough to disturb the illusion of control. And in that carefully curated silence, the moment happened fast and sharp when the server paused, lifted Marcus's black card between two fingers, and glanced toward the host as if waiting for permission to breathe. Someone chuckled. Then Richard Whitmore smiled, the practiced smile of a white billionaire who had never been questioned in rooms like this, and said lightly, loud enough for those nearest to hear, that they didn't usually accept those cards out here, not for events of this level. The words floated for half a second before landing, and the deck felt different immediately, tighter, charged, eyes shifting toward Marcus not with curiosity, but with assessment. Marcus didn't move. He didn't correct anyone. He stood relaxed in a navy linen jacket, no logo, no watch screaming value, hands loose at his sides, looking less like a guest trying to belong and more like a man who had already decided the outcome. Around him were investors, tech founders, heirs, all white, all dressed in versions of wealth meant to be recognized instantly. And yet none of them knew that the quiet man they were measuring had already signed off on numbers larger than the cost of this yacht before breakfast. The server hesitated again, cheeks warm, unsure whether to proceed, while Richard leaned back against the rail, glass in hand, amused, adding that misunderstandings happen when people wander into spaces they don't fully understand. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. The insult was clean, polite, wrapped in manners, the kind that leaves no bruise but still draws blood. Marcus felt the familiar weight settle in his chest. Not anger, not surprise, but recognition, the echo of conference rooms where his proposals had been praised until faces looked up and realized who was speaking, of deals slowed down by sudden requests for extra verification, of smiles that tightened the moment he entered. The ocean rolled on, unbothered, the yacht steady beneath their feet, and for a brief second the entire gathering waited to see what Marcus would do, whether he would explain himself, defend himself, perform gratitude for being allowed to stay. Instead, he met the server's eyes and nodded calmly, a small gesture that said more than words, then turned his gaze back to Richard with a look that wasn't offended but focused, as if a calculation had just finished running. No one noticed his phone vibrate once in his pocket, or the single message already sent, or the way his posture shifted from guest to decision-maker. To everyone else on the White Meridian, it still looked like a minor social slip, an awkward moment smoothed over with laughter and champagne. But beneath the polished deck and the soft music, something irreversible had already begun, because Marcus Ellison had just been reminded exactly how expensive disrespect could be. Marcus Ellison had not come aboard the White Meridian to impress anyone, and that intention showed in every detail of how he carried himself as the yacht cut smoothly through the water at just under 20 knots, engines humming low beneath polished teak and chrome. He had declined the helicopter transfer, stepped onto the dock alone, and boarded with nothing more than a slim leather folio and a phone set to silent, moving through the crew and guests like someone accustomed to spaces where names mattered less than outcomes. To the people gathered on deck, he looked like an outlier by design, a black man dressed with restraint among men who wore their wealth loudly. But to Marcus, this was familiar terrain, the kind of room where he had learned early that visibility could be a liability. He listened more than he spoke, took in the way Richard Whitmore held court near the rail, the way introductions were exchanged like currency, the way certain jokes landed and others were ignored, and he cataloged it all with the same discipline he used when reviewing balance sheets. Years earlier, Marcus had learned that power announced too soon invited resistance, so he let the assumption stand, allowing the host and his guests to believe what they wanted about the man sipping mineral water near the aft deck. He had built his career this way, entering rooms quietly, absorbing tone and hierarchy before revealing leverage, and the yacht was no different, just another enclosed world governed by ego and unspoken rules. As the sun dipped lower, conversations drifted toward the deal that had brought everyone together. A complex energy infrastructure project rumored to be worth nearly $4 billion, and Marcus heard his name referenced indirectly, spoken as an abstract concept rather than a person, as if the funding behind it were an idea instead of a decision-maker standing a few feet away. He did not correct them. He remembered boardrooms in Chicago and San Francisco where he had sat through similar moments, letting others talk past him until the moment's silence became more powerful than interruption. The server's earlier hesitation replayed in his mind not as an insult, but as confirmation, another data point in a pattern he understood well, and he noted how quickly people filled gaps with judgment when comfort was threatened. Marcus thought back to the first company he had founded in his early 30s, the meetings where investors had asked who was really in charge, the introductions where his credentials were questioned twice while others were waved through, and how those moments had taught him patience as strategy. On the White Meridian, that patience settled over him again, calm and deliberate, as he watched Richard laugh with a group of guests who assumed the future was already decided in their favor. Marcus knew otherwise. He knew that the numbers being discussed casually over cocktails traced back to accounts he controlled, that the signatures everyone was waiting for were his, and that the ease with which people dismissed him now would make what came next unavoidable. He shifted his weight slightly, feeling the steady motion of the yacht beneath his feet, and allowed the conversation to continue without him, because part two of any negotiation was always observation, and observation, when done properly, revealed everything. The subtle shift began when the conversation tightened around the deal itself, and the easy laughter gave way to calculation, because money always changed the temperature of a room, especially one floating miles from shore. Richard Whitmore motioned for fresh drinks and spoke about the project as if it were already his to announce, describing timelines, projected returns, and the kind of legacy it would leave, and each sentence assumed agreement before it was earned. Marcus stood close enough to hear every word, close enough to be included if anyone had bothered to look his way, yet far enough to remain invisible by choice. Watching how often Richard spoke over others, how quickly people nodded, how rarely anyone questioned him. When the server returned, tray balanced carefully, Marcus noticed the glance again, quick and uncertain, and this time it was not the card that caused hesitation but the question of whether Marcus should even be served first. The drink was offered last, quietly, as if correcting an earlier mistake, and Marcus accepted it with a polite nod that carried no warmth or offense, just acknowledgement. Around him, a few guests noticed, then looked away, the way people do when something feels wrong but confronting it would cost social comfort. One man leaned toward another and murmured something Marcus did not need to hear to understand, because the tone was familiar, the assumption clear, and the judgment already formed. Richard continued, remarking that large investments required trust, that certain partners needed reassurance, that experience mattered, and with each phrase he drew an invisible line around himself and those who looked like him. Marcus felt the line settle, not across the deck, but across history, across moments he had lived through before, and he remained still, letting the words hang where they belonged. A woman near the bow shifted her stance, eyes moving between Marcus and Richard, uncertainty flickering across her face as if she sensed a missing piece, while a younger crew member adjusted a headset and pretended not to listen, shoulders stiff with discomfort. The yacht cut through a swell, glasses clinked softly, and for a second the sound covered the silence that followed Richard's final remark about who truly understood risk. Marcus exhaled slowly, steady, reminding himself that the most revealing part of any negotiation came before anyone realized it had begun. He watched how quickly respect evaporated when it was assumed rather than earned, how easily people confused familiarity with authority, and how comfort bred carelessness. His phone remained untouched. In his pocket, though he felt its weight, the reminder of decisions waiting to be executed, of systems already aligned. Richard's voice rose again, joking now, suggesting that not everyone aboard had the capacity to participate at this level, laughter rippling unevenly across the deck. and Marcus saw it land with the dull thud of entitlement. No one challenged it. No one corrected it. The yacht seemed to glide on as if nothing had changed, but Marcus knew the tone had shifted irreversibly, because the moment had crossed from ignorance into assumption, and assumption was expensive. He took a small step closer to the rail, gaze resting on the horizon where the sky met the water, calm and unmoved. And in that stillness he made a decision not out of emotion but clarity. The subtle humiliation had done its work, exposing priorities, revealing character, and setting the stage, and Marcus Ellison did not need to announce himself to understand that the next move would not belong to the man holding the microphone, but to the one holding the future. The first crack did not come from Marcus but from the people around him, because silence has a way of drawing attention once it lingers too long, and on the white meridian that silence began to feel heavier than the ocean air. A woman named Elaine Porter, a venture partner from Santa Monica, found herself watching Marcus more closely than the host, noticing how he listened without interruption, how his reactions were measured rather than performative, and how none of the small slights seemed to move him. She had spent years in rooms like this and had learned to recognize confidence that did not need validation, and something about Marcus did not align with the assumptions being made. Nearby, a junior deck officer named Thomas adjusted a tray and slowed his steps, aware that the earlier hesitation with the card had not gone unnoticed, aware too that the correction afterward felt less like courtesy and more like quiet damage control. Elaine leaned slightly toward another guest and asked, in a low voice, who Marcus was, not because she expected an answer, but because she sensed there should be one, and when the response came back vague and dismissive, it only sharpened her curiosity. Richard Whitmore continued speaking, growing more animated as attention returned to him, yet his confidence now carried an edge, as if he were unconsciously reinforcing his position, repeating assumptions to make them real. Marcus caught the shift without turning his head, registering how eyes began to flicker between him and Richard, how a few conversations stalled, how the room recalibrated without admitting it. Thomas set down a glass near Marcus and hesitated just long enough to meet his gaze, offering a quiet, respectful nod that was not part of any protocol, then moved on, heart beating faster than usual, because he understood that moments like this were remembered. Elaine stepped closer to the rail, placing herself within Marcus's orbit without announcement, and asked him a neutral question about the coastline ahead, her tone casual, her interest genuine. Marcus answered simply, without explanation or embellishment, and in that exchange she felt the weight of what had been missing from the earlier conversation, substance. She glanced back toward Richard, who was laughing loudly now, unaware that his audience was thinning, and for the first time that afternoon she wondered if everyone aboard had misread the room. Others began to sense it too, the way people do when a narrative starts to fray, and the laughter lost its easy rhythm, replaced by something cautious. Marcus remained composed, letting the shift happen on its own, understanding that credibility often transferred quietly before it ever announced itself. He thought of past moments when a single question had changed the direction of a meeting, when one person's doubt had given others permission to reconsider, and he recognized the pattern unfolding again. The yacht sailed on, steady and elegant, but the social current had turned, and the witness was no longer just observing. Elaine listened more intently now. Thomas moved with renewed awareness, and a handful of guests began to reassess their earlier judgments without speaking them aloud. Richard noticed the change too late, mistaking it for fatigue or distraction, still certain of his place at the center. Marcus, standing at the edge of the deck, felt the balance shift imperceptibly, not toward confrontation but toward clarity, because when witnesses awaken, the story stops belonging to the loudest voice and starts belonging to the truth waiting beneath it. The breaking point arrived not with a shout, but with a sentence delivered too easily, because confidence unchallenged often forgets its audience, and Richard Whitmore finally said the quiet part out loud. He turned slightly, glass raised, and remarked that projects of this scale required people who had grown up around real capital, not newcomers trying to buy credibility with impressive-looking cards, and the laughter that followed was thinner than before, forced by habit rather than agreement. The words landed where Richard intended them to, but they also traveled farther than he expected, reaching the edges of the deck where attention had already shifted. Marcus felt the sentence settle, not as an insult but as a trigger, because it echoed a voice from years earlier, a venture partner in New York who had smiled politely and said Marcus was impressive but not quite the right cultural fit for the room. In that memory, Marcus had been younger, seated at a long table under fluorescent lights, listening as his proposal was praised and then shelved, watching the same idea get funded months later under a different face. He remembered leaving that meeting without anger, only resolve, and returning to his office to build without permission. On the yacht, the memory flickered and passed, leaving behind clarity instead of resentment. Richard continued, adding that trust was built over generations, that some people simply understood the rhythm of wealth, and Marcus noticed Elaine's posture stiffen, noticed Thomas pause mid-step, noticed how the air no longer absorbed the words but reflected them back. Elaine set her glass down with deliberate care, eyes narrowing not at Marcus but at Richard, and for the first time someone did not smile along. Marcus shifted his stance slightly, grounding himself as the past brushed against the present, recalling a hotel lobby in Los Angeles where a clerk had asked for additional verification while others walked past unchecked, recalling the slow burn of understanding that excellence alone would never be enough in certain rooms. He had learned then to let people reveal themselves fully before responding, because premature defense wasted leverage. Richard's comment lingered, and a few guests exchanged looks that asked the same unspoken question: did he really just say that? And in that hesitation the mood finally broke. Marcus did not raise his voice or correct the assumption. He simply looked at Richard, calm and steady, the way one looks at a variable that has just been miscalculated. The yacht glided forward, engine steady, the horizon unchanged, but the social balance tipped, and what had been indulgent became uncomfortable. Elaine cleared her throat softly, not to interrupt but to signal presence, and asked Richard to clarify what he meant, her tone measured but firm. Richard laughed it off, waving a hand, insisting he was only speaking generally, but the ease was gone, replaced by something defensive. Marcus felt the moment lock into place, the way a deal did when all the terms were finally visible, and he knew there was no going back to polite ambiguity. The breaking point was complete, not because someone had been humiliated loudly, but because the mask had slipped in front of witnesses who could no longer pretend not to see. Marcus thought again of that younger version of himself, walking out of rooms quietly, and he recognized how far he had come, how much ground had been covered since then, and how unnecessary explanation now felt. He did not need to confront Richard to understand that the decision forming in his mind would reshape the rest of the afternoon, because disrespect, once confirmed, carried a cost that did not require argument, only execution. Marcus Ellison did not respond to the comment directly, because by the time the line had been crossed, words were no longer the most efficient instrument, and efficiency had always been his advantage. He allowed the conversation to move past him, let Richard reclaim the center with another joke and a raised glass. And in that lull, he slid his phone from his pocket with the ease of someone checking the time rather than shifting the course of events. His thumb moved once, deliberately, opening a secure thread that had been quiet for most of the afternoon, and he typed a short message without urgency, confirming what had already been prepared hours earlier. There was no visible tension in his posture, no hint that anything significant had changed, and to the casual observer, he looked like a guest disengaging politely from a conversation that no longer interested him. Elaine watched the movement from the corner of her eye and noticed how controlled it was, how there was no frustration in it, only certainty, and she felt a chill of recognition as she realized that Marcus had not been waiting for permission to speak, but for permission to act. The yacht continued its smooth arc through the water, the sun casting long shadows across the deck, and Richard launched into a summary of next steps, outlining timelines as if the signatures were a formality, unaware that the foundation beneath his assumptions had already been withdrawn. Marcus listened with the same calm focus he had shown all afternoon, nodding once at a technical point, absorbing details that would soon be irrelevant, and he thought of the systems he had built precisely for moments like this, teams trained to move quietly, agreements structured to be reversible, contingencies layered beneath every headline number. His phone vibrated softly, a single response appearing on the screen, and he glanced at it just long enough to confirm alignment before returning his attention to the deck. Nothing about his demeanor suggested retaliation or anger, because this was not personal in the way Richard believed power struggles were personal. This was structural. This was procedural. Elaine shifted her weight and caught Marcus's eye briefly, something unspoken passing between them, and she understood then that the deal everyone was discussing so casually was no longer alive in the way they assumed. A few feet away, Thomas the deck officer adjusted a line and felt the atmosphere change without knowing why, sensing only that the balance of the room had moved somewhere else. Richard continued, his voice carrying over the hum of the engines, explaining how partnerships like this required alignment of values, and Marcus almost smiled at the irony, because alignment had just been clarified more cleanly than any meeting could have done. He did not interrupt, did not announce a decision, did not seek an audience, because the most effective reversals happened before anyone realized they were being reversed. Instead, he asked a simple, neutral question about logistics, just enough to keep the conversation flowing, just enough to confirm the assumption that everything was still proceeding as planned. Elaine listened closely, now fully aware that the calm she had noticed earlier was not passivity but control, and she wondered how many times she had mistaken volume for authority in rooms like this. The sun dipped closer to the horizon, the yacht steady and elegant, and Marcus felt the quiet satisfaction of a plan executing exactly as designed, knowing that when the moment came, it would not require explanation or raised voices, only acknowledgement. For now, he remained exactly where he was, composed, observant, letting the others speak themselves further into certainty, because the counter move had already been made, and all that remained was the timing. The reveal did not arrive with drama but with precision, because Marcus Ellison understood that truth carried more weight when it was delivered without ornament. Richard Whitmore finished outlining his vision and looked around the deck as if expecting affirmation, his confidence still intact, and it was in that pause that Marcus finally spoke, his voice calm, even, and impossible to ignore. He addressed Richard by name, not loudly, not aggressively, but clearly enough that conversations nearby stilled and attention shifted toward the sound. Marcus said that before timelines moved any further, there was one clarification that needed to be made, and the simplicity of the statement drew eyes toward him in a way nothing else had all afternoon. Richard smiled thinly, amused, as if indulging a late question, and gestured for Marcus to continue. Marcus met his gaze without challenge or apology, and said that he had been listening carefully to the assumptions being made about who belonged at this level, about who understood capital, and about who was qualified to decide the future of the project being discussed. The deck grew quiet, the ocean audible beneath the hull, and Marcus continued, explaining that while he appreciated the hospitality, he needed to correct a fundamental misunderstanding. He stated, evenly, that the capital anchoring the project, the portion that made the numbers viable at scale, came from his firm, and that he was not a peripheral participant but the primary funding authority. A few heads turned sharply, disbelief flickering across faces that had not bothered to learn his name earlier. Richard laughed once, reflexively, then stopped when Marcus did not join him. Marcus let the silence do its work before adding the sentence that recalibrated the entire afternoon, telling Richard that mocking the source of funding while standing on borrowed certainty was not just short-sighted but consequential, and that the $3.8 billion deal being discussed would not be moving forward. The words landed cleanly, without flourish, and for a moment no one reacted, as if the room needed time to process the reversal. Elaine's breath caught, understanding crystallizing as she replayed the afternoon through a new lens, and Thomas the deck officer froze where he stood, the significance of the moment registering fully. Richard's expression shifted from amusement to confusion, then to something tighter, as he asked Marcus to clarify, his voice suddenly stripped of its earlier ease. Marcus obliged, calmly explaining that respect was not a courtesy but a prerequisite, that assumptions had been made openly, and that trust could not exist in a space where bias dictated value. He did not accuse or insult. He simply stated facts, outlining that the decision had already been executed and that his team would handle the formal notifications once they returned to shore. The yacht seemed smaller now, the polished surfaces reflecting faces caught between shock and recalculation, and the authority that had centered itself around Richard minutes earlier began to fracture. Richard attempted to recover, speaking faster, insisting that this was a misunderstanding, that words had been taken out of context, but Marcus remained steady, listening without interruption, because he had already heard everything he needed. He concluded by reminding Richard that deals of this magnitude were not favors granted by hosts, but commitments earned through integrity, and that today had made the absence of that integrity unmistakably clear. The silence that followed was not awkward but definitive, the kind that signaled an ending rather than a pause. Marcus did not wait for a response or an apology. He stepped back slightly, reclaiming the quiet space he had occupied all afternoon, and in doing so made it clear that the conversation, like the deal, was over. Around him, the witnesses absorbed the shift, understanding that they had just seen power revealed not through volume or spectacle, but through clarity, and that nothing about the White Meridian would feel the same after this moment. The collapse unfolded quietly, almost politely, the way real power shifts often do, because nothing needed to be overturned when the structure had already hollowed itself out. Richard Whitmore attempted to regain footing by reframing the situation as a misunderstanding, his words moving faster than his thoughts, but each sentence only highlighted how much ground had already been lost. Around the deck, phones buzzed softly as messages arrived, not dramatic alerts but confirmations, the kind that carried weight precisely because they were expected. Elaine checked her screen once and looked up with a new expression, one that held neither surprise nor sympathy, only recognition, and she realized that the project she had flown out to celebrate had just ceased to exist in any meaningful form. Conversations splintered into fragments as guests stepped aside, whispering calculations to themselves, reassessing alliances, mentally, redrawing maps of influence that no longer centered on the host. Thomas, the deck officer, felt the tension ripple through the crew, instructions suddenly uncertain, smiles forced where confidence had been routine, because everyone sensed that something foundational had shifted even if they could not articulate it. Richard's posture changed as well, shoulders tightening, gestures becoming sharper, the effortless ease replaced by urgency, and he asked Marcus whether this was truly necessary, whether pride was worth dismantling such an opportunity. Marcus listened without interruption, the same way he had listened all afternoon, and when Richard finished, Marcus responded with a single sentence, explaining that necessity had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with standards. The simplicity of the reply left no room for negotiation. A few guests nodded subtly, others avoided eye contact, and one by one they began to disengage, not out of loyalty to Marcus, but out of instinct, because proximity to collapsing authority carried risk. Elaine moved closer to Marcus and thanked him quietly for his clarity, acknowledging that she had seen enough rooms excuse behavior like Richard's under the banner of tradition, and that today had been different. Marcus accepted the comment with a brief nod, neither savoring the moment nor dismissing it, because validation was not the objective. Richard's phone rang, and the call he answered changed his expression completely, the color draining from his face as the reality of withdrawn commitments reached him from beyond the deck. He ended the call abruptly and looked around as if expecting support, but the circle that had surrounded him earlier had thinned, leaving too much open space. The yacht continued forward, immaculate and unchanged, yet it felt suddenly exposed, its luxury stripped of certainty, because wealth without alignment had a way of revealing itself as temporary. Marcus did not linger to observe the aftermath. He adjusted his jacket, thanked the crew member nearest him for the hospitality, and prepared to disembark at the next opportunity, his movements unhurried and precise. As he walked away from the center of the deck, the conversations behind him faltered, the momentum broken beyond repair, and the realization settled in among the remaining guests that they had just witnessed the dismantling of a future that had been assumed inevitable. Richard stood near the rail, staring out at the water, his authority reduced to posture without leverage, and for the first time that afternoon he understood that what had been lost was not a deal, but control. Marcus felt the yacht's motion beneath his feet one last time, and allowed himself a quiet breath, not of triumph, but of closure, because the collapse was complete, and it had required no spectacle, only the withdrawal of support that should never have been taken for granted. Marcus Ellison stepped off the White Meridian with the same quiet composure he had carried onto it, the dock steady beneath his shoes as the yacht idled behind him, gleaming and intact, yet fundamentally altered by what had just occurred. The ocean breeze moved past without ceremony, indifferent to wealth or wounded pride, and Marcus paused only briefly to look back, not at Richard Whitmore specifically, but at the idea the yacht had represented, the belief that power was inherited rather than earned, that belonging could be policed by tone and tradition. Elaine stood a short distance away, her expression thoughtful, and she watched Marcus with a new understanding of what leadership looked like when stripped of performance. She would later describe the afternoon not as a confrontation but as a correction, a recalibration of assumptions she had accepted for too long. The crew resumed their routines, quieter now, and the guests who remained aboard avoided the center of the deck, instinctively aware that the story had ended even if the vessel continued its course. Marcus turned toward the waiting car, phone already alive with updates confirming what he had known would follow, clean confirmations, orderly transitions, the system working exactly as intended. There was no satisfaction in it, only alignment, because outcomes like this were not about winning but about refusing to subsidize disrespect. As the car door closed, Marcus allowed himself a moment of reflection, thinking of the younger version of himself who had once internalized rejection as motivation, who had learned to build quietly because noise invited resistance. That lesson had stayed with him, evolving into a philosophy that guided every decision he made, that dignity was not reactive and power did not need to announce itself to be effective. The road stretched ahead, familiar and unremarkable, and Marcus felt grounded in the certainty that today had not been an exception but a continuation of standards he had always held. The deal that collapsed would be replaced by others built on clearer terms. Partners chosen for integrity rather than proximity, and the ripple from this moment would travel farther than anyone on that yacht realized. Somewhere behind him, Richard Whitmore would be explaining, rationalizing, reframing the loss as bad luck or misunderstanding. But those explanations would not restore what had been forfeited, because credibility once exposed did not regenerate on command. Marcus knew that the story would circulate quietly through the same circles that had dismissed him earlier, a cautionary tale retold with altered details, and that was enough. He did not need recognition from rooms that mistook exclusion for quality. As the car emerged into traffic, Marcus rested his hands easily, breathing steady, carrying forward the clarity earned through experience rather than reaction. He did not raise his voice on that yacht, did not argue his worth, did not demand acknowledgement, because none of that was necessary. He had raised the standard instead, leaving behind a reminder that access without respect was meaningless and that power, when exercised with restraint, had the final word. The white meridian receded into the distance, just another vessel on the water, and Marcus Ellison moved on, unchanged in posture but affirmed in principle, knowing that justice did not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrived as a closed door, a canceled deal, and the quiet certainty of walking away intact.